fruits themselves are considered to be a luxury. And that in Chassidus and Kabbalah, there's a Torah aspect of the Torah, describes it to be that this is the service of pleasure, that it's not just enough to serve Hashem, but as we discussed many times, is brought in the Torah, in Parshat Kitavo, Tachat Hashem lo avadetem et Hashem lokechem misimcho tu levav umirosh kol, that all the curses that Moshe Rabbeinu enumerated in the book of Devarim in Parshat Kitavo will occur not because we didn't serve Hashem, but rather because we didn't serve Hashem with happiness, joy, and more specifically from all that which Hashem blessed us. Memela, the service should be with happiness, because if it's not done out of happiness and joy, and specifically from that which Hashem blessed us, then there's a question regarding our service. If it's real service, if we're serving Hashem or we're serving ourselves. To serve in any capacity, for example, in a relationship, as we discussed in a relationship class, that the foundation of a relationship, that each and every one who is invested in the relationship serves the relationship as a whole, and that serves the one who he or she is relating to. But we know in the confines of a relationship, there's a way to do things out of a sense of obligation, because this is what's expected, and this is what I need to do. And while that is a foundational approach to any type of service, because we cannot hinge our service based on our moods or lack of, but rather as this is our purpose. And if this is your true purpose, it's not enough just to do it with obligation, but we have to do this happily and joyfully. Recognizes that all the details that we've been endowed with are the details which are necessary in order for this relationship to not just continue, but to flourish and produce and bear its own fruits. It's just the perspective needs to be augmented, changed, and perhaps looked upon from a different perspective. But nevertheless, it has to be done with happiness. One of the greatest impediments that we have for happiness, and not only just for happiness in a relationship, but a happy life, just being happy with our lives, is something which is brought in this week's Parsha Yitro. And this is a foundational Parsha in the Torah, because in this Parsha, the Jewish people receive the Torah. And we know that, as we've been discussing, the entirety of the book of Shemot thus far teaches us how to get out of our own Egypt, our own Mitzrayim v'Gvulim, boundaries and constrictions, the dire straits that each and every one of us has within ourselves. We spoke about the need for Moshe Rabbeinu, the need not to be a bystander in our purpose, in our life, and in holiness. In other words, not to think that it's somebody else is going to get to it, or it's not my circus, not my monkeys. I didn't start this. I didn't do this. We didn't start the fire. It was already there before we started, and so forth. But rather, each and every one of us has to be very proactive in order to be able to push ourselves and our relationships and our lives out of the confines of dire straits. And as we discussed already in the previous week's class, this is, as in psychology, what is deemed metabolizing the trauma. That it's not enough just to say, well, I didn't choose these parents, and I didn't choose this setting, and I didn't choose this body, and I didn't choose this relationship. And all of that is animal soul talk as a defense for why it doesn't want to get out of itself. And for that reason, Hashem brought the 10 plagues to the Egyptians, not just into Egyptian, but to demonstrate to the Jewish people that the world that we live in is His world. And He is very intimately involved with the world. And every single detail and nuance of the world, as nitty-gritty as it may seem, it is an expression of God's ultimate benevolence. Afterwards, we discussed the courage, the need for courage in order to be able to get out of our routines, of our not to eliminate the routines. Sometimes, and not sometimes, but healthy and holy routines are foundational to a healthy and holy life. But it just can't, our lives, nor any aspect of our life could be routine based. In other words, it can't just be out of a habit. There's something very perilous, very dangerous of a habit formed life because as we know, there is a concept of tmidim kisidram umusafim kilchasan. The Tamid offering, the one sheep in the morning and one sheep in the evening that has to be offered up and has been offered up since the days that we were in the desert. It's called the Tamid offering, a continual offering. And the reason why it's called continual offering, even though it's only twice daily, is because it was prescribed to be given 365 days a year, including Shabbat and including Yom Kippurim. And that is consistency, routine. There has to be the routine daily offering. In other words, each day we have to offer, as we know, and we're going to be discussing soon enough, but we've already discussed in prior classes that in introducing the concept of korbanot, and the word korban etymologically is related to the word kiruv, closeness. In order to achieve closeness, it's not enough just to give a piece of yourself, but you have to give yourself. And that's why in introducing the korbanot of the book of Vayikra, Adam ki akriv mikem, that a person has to give from themselves. In other words, not just the dispense, I'll give a piece of myself, the part that's comfortable for me. But that's not, which is not comfortable, I cannot give. Because that is tantamount, as we discussed in last week's Farbrengen, that is tantamount to being in the majority of ourselves being liberated, or the majority of ourselves being invested in a relationship. But that means that there's a piece of ourselves which is still not liberated or not in the relationship, and that piece is still in darkness. And that's compared to a person who is behind bars and somehow managed to squeeze himself or herself out, for the most part, out of those bars, but a significant part of themselves is, or even a small part of themselves is still stuck behind the bar. Although the majority is out, they still can't leave. And for that purpose, it's not enough to give a piece of ourselves, but we have to give ourselves in our complete form with everything that we have. Adam ki akriv mikem, it has to come from ourselves. And so to be able to get out of our whatever prison, it's not enough just to formulate good habits. Good habits and good routines, holy routines are foundational. But then there has to be musafin kil chasan. There has to be the musaf offering that on Shabbat and Yom Tov and Rosh Chodesh we give and we offer up an additional offering that is pertinent to that particular day. It's called the musaf, the additional offering. So there is Midin Kisidram, the Tamid offering prescribed according to its order. In other words, it has to be a framework. And that framework was routine, and that's good. But then there has to be musafim kilchasan. Then there has to be, based on this framework, what are we adding to it? How are we growing from it? we showed this. We did an experiment. I don't have the pieces out on me because it just occurred to me. But if you put a seed in a little cap, like a bottle cap, as you say, without turning the cap over, without picking the seed out, how does the seed get out? The only way to do this is organically, to put a fertile earth on it and water it, and the seed grows and becomes a full-fledged plant or a tree. Then that's the entire purpose of that confines wasn't to stymie the seed, but rather to let it grow, and to be able to, in order to be able to metamorphosize into a full plant or a full tree. So too, there has to be, in the routine itself, there has to be a question that we have to ask ourselves prior to go to sleep on a nightly level when we do the cheshbon nefesh, the soul counting, the soul reckoning. How am I growing? How did I grow today in thought, speech, and action? I know what was comfortable for me when I woke up, but how did I improve on that in the time that I was up, in the daytime when there was light and there was warmth? But then after getting out of Egypt, we had to go through the sea, as we discussed last week's parsha. And that is, the entire purpose is to reveal and go to the sea that the world is God's world. And he put us here not to chaz v'shalom challenge us, not to chaz v'shalom stymie us, but for us to be able to grow. In order for us to be able to grow, we have to know that this is God's world, because we're not programmed to be turned on to life, to purpose, and be weary at the same time. A person who's constantly weary and anxious is indicative of the very fact that the animal soul is processing toxic emotions. And it's depleting them, as we discussed in the Warrior to Warrior class from the Tanya, chapter 26 of Tanya, which is coming up. When a person is processing toxic emotions like anxiety, sadness, depression, anger, and so on and so forth, it depletes them from their natural born joy and happiness that they possess in the neshama. And that will leave the person, if they have some sort of a consciousness, living a routine life just to survive, but they're not living. The issue with survival is that we're not programmed for survival. Animals are programmed for survival. We are here to live. The Torah explicitly commands us to choose life, not survival, not just mere existence, that to occupy time and space, day in and day out, but rather we have to grow. And in growth, has to be, as the Torah prescribes growth, they have to go from strength to strength. And as the Rebbe brought in Basel Ganim from this year, and we learned it a few weeks last week, the Chayil, they'll go from strength to strength. The word Chayil means like an army, that you have to take, the growth has to come out of a sense of obligation, not that I'm in the mood to grow, but this is what I'm here for, my entire purpose. And knowing that this is your entire purpose, God-given purpose, and he chose you for this, that in itself should bring you the greatest amount of happiness and joy and satisfaction. Because you're chosen by the King himself, by the King of all kings, to live your life, to accomplish what you're here to accomplish. And as we discussed in the last 2 weeks' classes, that involves also impediments, what seems to be impediments and challenges, et cetera, but really those are all the recipe that each and every one of us needs individually in order to grow. And if we're doing this, as Alter Rebbe explains in Tanya, even God forbid a person messes up, and they really mess up, God forbid, that still should not take away their joy and happiness, just the opposite. Their joy and happiness has to increase now. Why? Because now I get to do tshuva. And if Hashem is allowing me to do tshuva, to be able to repair this world of his, even the world that I am and myself added to, then that's like the king who hires a maid for his court in order to clean it up. There is a minister of finance in the king's court. There's a minister of transportation in the king's court, et cetera, and each minister obviously is happy in the very fact that they're chosen and they have the zchut, the merit, in order to serve in their position. And what's more, and parenthetically, I was learning matters that pertain to marriage and to kavanot of marriage, and one of the basic kavanot, but it's very pertinent, is to be able to serve the king, but the concept of marriage is to be able to have another child. Yosef li ben acher, that I should take from the acher and add it to be a ben. I should take from the other and make it a son, like the name of Yosef. That Rachel called Yosef li ben acher. Hashem should add me another son. But as Rebbe explained, Yosef li mi acher ben, that I should be able to utilize the acher, the other side of my life, in order to make it a ben, a son to Hashem. So there's a parable that's given that a trusted servant of the king who's getting on with his years, and he was a bachelor because his entire life was serving the king. But as he's getting older, he starts bemoaning that if after 120 years, who am I leaving in order to take my place, in order to serve the king? So for that reason, he got married on a child, and he trained the child in how to serve the king. So too with our marriages, we have to understand that our marriages, as fulfilling as they should be on a personal level, emotional level, mental, psychological level, and how much more so spiritual level, but the marriage in itself should be a point of service to Hashem. And for that reason, we have the mitzvah of chinuch habanim v'abanot. We have the mitzvah of inaugurating and raising our children to serve Hashem. Not like the world says it, to educate kids by indoctrinating them with details and data that really has nothing to do with who they are and what they're here to do, but rather to be able to equip the children with social, emotional abilities to be able to grow from strength to strength. So too, the minister of sanitation in the king's court, he too or she too has to be proud of the very fact that they have the privilege of cleaning the king's court. Otherwise, it's going to be a dump. And as we discussed 2 weeks ago, from a letter from the Baal Shem Tov to one of his students, that he gave a mashal, he gave a parable of a woman who was hired to clean the king's court. And she was walking around dusting. And one of the ministers who walked by and asked her, "What are you doing?" She says, "I'm cleaning." He says, "But it doesn't seem to me like you're cleaning, you're dusting. Why don't you get down on your knees and clean?" He says, but if I get it down on my knees and clean, I'm going to tarnish my dress. And then if the king comes out, it's treasonous to stand in front of the king with a dirty dress. So I can't get down on my knees and clean. And the minister turns to the maid and says to her, "Then you don't understand your position here. Your position is to clean. If you have to get dirty, you have to get dirty." In other words, we shouldn't throw ourselves, God forbid, into dirt. But the dirt that each and every one of us gave is just like the dirt on a window that prevents the light from coming in. Well, wherever we notice that the light is yet to come in, this is what we need to clean. This is what we need to work on. And we have to do this happily. So even as Alter Rebbe explains, even God forbid if a person messes up, and now they have to do tshuva, they have to be happy with the very fact that they get to clean the king's court. Let's get into today's topic. Because in this week's Parsha, as we mentioned before, is the Parsha that we're giving the Torah. And as we discussed last week, freedom from and freedom to, that there's a freedom from oppression, yes, but a freedom of any sort that doesn't immediately translate into freedom to. What are you doing with this liberty? What are you doing with the fact that you're not oppressed now? Just not to be oppressed, that's not sufficient. A person's entire objective is not to be oppressed, as we are seeing in the world. When the world is now protesting this, if you're asked, okay, so what's your solution? There's no solution, but we want to fight the cause. Freedom from doesn't equate to anything other than chaos. if it's not led immediately to freedom, to liberty, to express your true self, your true purpose in this world. And for this reason, Moshe Rabbeinu continuously told Paro, let my people go so they could serve Hashem, so they could serve Hashem in the mountain. Not just let my people go. It's not enough just to let my people go. As we discussed, the ultimate reason for leaving Egypt wasn't because we're suffering in Egypt. Just because somebody's going through dire straits doesn't necessarily mean that they need to get out of it. But rather, as Moshe Rabbeinu continuously said, until now they had a purpose in Egypt. From now, they have no purpose here, and actually their purpose is out of Egypt. And for that reason, they need to leave. If there's no freedom to, then inevitably the freedom from will result in a worse oppression, as we've seen in history, than we began with. And for this reason, the aim of going out of Egypt and crossing the Yam Suf, et cetera, with everything that we've discussed, and that which the Torah discussed infinitely, ultimately was in order to receive the Torah. As when Moshe Rabbeinu asked Hashem in Parsha Shemot, and Rashi brings this, what merit do they have in order that they're leaving? And Hashem says, I have a great investment in this, that they're going to receive my Torah. In other words, the entire reason for leaving Egypt is because Hashem wanted to give us the Torah, and in Egypt wasn't the setting for that. And that's why the first of the 10 commandments is, I'm God your Lord, who took you out of Egypt from the house of slavery. And as we discussed in previous classes, that in itself is a mission statement of the entire Torah. As our Talmudic sages teach us that the first 2 commandments, Anechi, V'lo yelecha, that the first 2 commandments, I am God your Lord, and you should not have any other false gods before me, are the source of all the positive mitzvot and negative mitzvot. Positive mitzvot means how do we reveal God in this world? And negative mitzvot is how do we remove any impediments to this revelation? But in itself, the first of the 10 commandments is the source of the entire Torah. As the first of anything is the seminal state of it. And therefore, the first of the 10 commandments is, I'm God your Lord, who took you out of Egypt from the house of bondage, is the source of the entire Torah and the entire Judaism. And that in itself, as Chassidus, the inner dimension of Torah explains into a two-pronged mission statement. As Rambam explains, what is exactly the imperative here? All the other the subsequent commandments are commanding us to behave in a certain way or not to behave in a certain way. But in the first of the 10 commandments, I'm God your Lord who took you out of Egypt from the house of bondage, it doesn't seem to be a commandment. It just seems to be a statement. But the Rambam explains that in Anecha Hashem Elokecha, I'm God your Lord, there is the foundational mitzvah of getting to know God. You should know God. There's a machloket. Exactly, is it to have faith in God, or is it? I'm sorry. There's a disagreement amongst the sages. Is it the mitzvah of having faith in God, or the mitzvah of getting to know God? And that's a whole discussion in itself. But nevertheless, it's a mitzvah to know God. And in knowing God, we know is not just to know God in His framework, but to know God within our own framework, within the human condition, with everything that we have, to see God in everything, and to experience God and godliness in every single aspect of our lives. But in order to do this holistically and continuously, there's the other side, the other aspect of the commandment, which is, who took you out of Egypt from the house of bondage. One cannot get to know God, connect to infinity, draw down infinity, and be able to accomplish infinite accomplishment in their lives while they're buried in the muck, while they're in Egypt, while they have Egypt in their mind with a narrow mindset, a narrow perceptions, and so on and so forth. In order to be able to accomplish that which we're here to accomplish, we have to be out of Egypt. And with that reasoning, the prophet tells us, as the days that I took you out of Egypt, I'll show you wonders. There's a discourse in 1943 where the previous Rebbe asked a question on the verbiage. As the days you went out of Egypt, I'll show you wonders. Implying that just like we saw wonders in Egypt, when we came out of Egypt, with all the 10 plagues and the splitting of the sea and the manna and so too when Mashiach will come, Hashem will show us wonders. This pasuk needs to be really dissected and digested and internalized. But one of the points that the previous Rebbe asks is, in the verbiage, as the days you went out of Egypt. Well, it means the days. We went out of Egypt on the 15th of Nisan, in the midst of the day. It was one day. The next day we were already out of Egypt. But rather, every day we have to go out of Egypt. Every day is a push further. That we have to continue. So whatever was good yesterday, although it wasn't the same Egypt, it was the day before. But today, as we were discussing on Shabbat, if one is reveling in yesterday's accomplished, today means today they haven't lived yet. So while every single day in itself, a person has to push themselves out of Egypt. And that's a mission statement of Judaism. But we know, as brought in Sefer Yitzirah, the book of creation, Na'ut Sofam B'tchilatan, the end of anything is rooted in the beginning. As we say in Lecha Doidi on Shabbat, Friday night, Sof Ma'aseh B'machshava Tchila. The end deed is revealed, is rooted in the primal thought. That when a person wants to have a house, and then they start thinking about it, and then they start planning it, and they start actually building a bigger room, a smaller room, a taller room, and so on and so forth. All of that is still part of the planning and implementation, but it's still not the actual will. When is the will actually realized and revealed? When the person is sitting in a complete house. That's when they're sitting in their expression of their will. And so the expression of the will, the loftiest of the soul abilities, is revealed ultimately in practice. And so too, the first of anything is revealed in the last of it. That's how you know. If you want to know the origins of anything, look at the last piece of it. What did it produce? Well, the first of the 10 Commandments is, I'm God your Lord who took you out of Egypt from the house of bondage. The last of the 10 Commandments is, don't be envious. And that for that purpose, the entire Torah was given. Today we're going to focus on the ultimate getting out of Egypt. To deal with ourselves. To deal with perception which are not just flawed, they're downright toxic. Because we see in Torah history, and as well as in the world history, and of course in our own personal worlds, as a human being is a microcosm, a miniature world, that one of the greatest influencers on history is envy. We know that in the beginning, in creation, When Hashem hung the moon and the sun in the heavens, initially they were the same level, the same size. So the sun was bigger than the moon, and the moon was jealous of the sun, and for that reason Hashem cursed, not cursed, but degraded the moon to receive from the sun until Mashiach comes. Then we see later on the envy that the snake had towards Adam, that he wanted Chava, and that's why he enticed Chava. Later on, we see the jealousy, the envy that Cain had to Hevel, that Hashem readily accepted Hevel's offering and turned away from Cain's. Then later on, we see the jealousy that Joseph's brother had to Joseph. And this is just a drop of what the Torah tells us about about envy. There are many people who equate envy as a healthy disposition. Because if I don't have, why should I be envious? How come he has and I don't? It's not right. It's not right. I don't have and he has and she has. Why not me? But we know that envy could reduce a person to rubble on every single level. Because a person who's saturated with envy might be blessed with a lot of greatness, a lot of talents. But when a person is saturated with envy, they'll view what they have as nothing, and the other person what they have as everything. And they will completely denigrate themselves and everything that they were given. Many times we look at other people, how come their marriage works, and how come their parnasa, and their chinuch, and how come mine, and so on and so. That's envy. But that in itself reduces the person to not only and gives them, it enhances their negativity bias. And as we discussed in our class, that the negativity bias is such that it will get excited over the negative, and when something positive occurs, it just completely dismisses as though it doesn't matter, because the reality is, look at the negativity. And because of that, the more the person allows themselves to be saturated with envy, the more they're going to dismiss the positive things in their life. We know that if humanity would be able to rid themselves of this envy, then a majority of the human suffering will be dismissed with it as well. How much crime is committed? How much fighting happens out of envy? Is it possible to rid ourselves out of envy? Is it really possible for a human being to fulfill this commandment? Let's delve into this. Obviously, if the Torah is commanding us not to be envious, it means it is within our abilities to complete this, to complete this, and to holistically and completely. Because everything that the Torah commands us, as the Talmud says, Hashem doesn't ask according to His strength and His ability, but rather according to ours. Just like a healthy, and how much more so a holy parent, doesn't come with demands based on their needs, but rather gives the child tasks and strengths and abilities according to their abilities, their needs. Parenthetically, and we somewhat touched about it on Shabbat, Moshe Rabbeinu had a question about the splitting of the sea. And this is really the depth of the discussion we'll have before Pesach. But all the other commandments, the plagues, Moshe didn't question. But then again, our Talmud says that bringing two souls together to make a shidduch is just as difficult as splitting the sea. Why splitting the sea? Why not like the plague of blood, the plague of frogs, etc.? Why specifically the splitting of the sea? But generally speaking, everything that's created has a purpose. And that purpose is how it needs to act in order to be able to express God's desire in its creation. Water it conducts its purpose by flowing, by remaining liquid. With all the other plagues, there wasn't a transformation of the elements. There was just an augmentation of the elements, of the way it happened. With the splitting of the sea, the water, the Torah says, became it became like a wall. Yes, it remained liquid, but a liquid wall, which goes against its purpose. And without getting to the nitty-gritty of this concept, but we will before Pesach, as we touched upon on Shabbat, the Midrash teaches us that when Hashem created water, he made a condition with the water. That when the Jewish people will come by Yam Suf, he will split in front of the Jewish people. In other words, that condition was already embedded in part of its creation. It wasn't an augmentation of it. It wasn't a change of it. It was revealing what it was needed to do from the moment it was created. And the same applies when it comes to for educating our children, or even ourselves. The aim is not to train ourselves. We train animals. There is a measure of training when it comes to dealing with our children to impart upon them atomic habits, some of which they might not understand yet. But the overall aim of chinuch, to inaugurate, not to educate, but to inaugurate a human being for life, is not to train them. Because even if you train an animal and they're able to stand on 2 feet and even mimic a human being, it is after all a trained animal, nothing else. As the expression goes, even if you win the rat race, you're still a rat. You're just a richer rat. That doesn't take away from the ratness. We know the very famous mashal. A father tells his son to sit down and the son refuses. And the father says, sit down, and the son refuses. And then the father basically takes his hand and pushes the son to sit down. And the son looks up to the father and he says, you should know, Daddy, that while you force me to sit, in my mind, I'm thinking of me standing up. What does that mean? And one way to look at it is in training, while the exterior is in the right place, might be in the right place, but the interior hasn't been dealt with yet. And it'll remain rebellious against even the most prestigious of situations. And the greatest impediment is somewhere down the line, it might disrupt the consistency. For this, in chinuch, we have to mete out to the children according to what they need in order to raise them. And therefore, a healthy and holy parents does not demand from their children based on their own needs, but rather for the children's need, according to their style, according to their ability, because you want to be able to raise the child as who he or she is, not to be a functioning robot. For that, Hashem already has angels. To us, he gives free choice, but he wants us to implement our choice, our lives, and so on and so forth. And for this reason, the sea in itself, Moshe Rabbeinu asked us, the question was, are we changing the sea? Is that what we're doing here? And Hashem says, no, this is the entire purpose. I created the sea for this purpose. I created the water with this purpose, that when you guys come over here, it should split. In other words, I'm revealing its innate purpose. It might have not been openly revealed for thousands of years, but in the right time, it will flourish. The purpose has to come out, be revealed. Let's go back to envy. When Hashem gives us the mitzvah of don't envy, there's a question: is it humanly possible to achieve this? And the Torah says, of course it is. If it wasn't achievable, and not just in a way that we do so begrudgingly, but as we discussed before, in a way that we grow happily and with joy, then Hashem would never command us. But in this commandment, Hashem allowed, as we discussed, the concept of commandment, mitzvah. On one hand, it is a mitzvah, it is a commandment. And as we discussed prior, the Torah explains that Hashem only commands us regarding thought, speech, and actions which are not typical to the human condition, which go against the grain of the human condition. Anything we're commanded means it doesn't come naturally. And we have to be told to do this. For example, we're not commanded to eat, we're commanded to eat kosher food. Because eating is something that every single species does, on one measure or another. But even eating kosher doesn't seem to fit the human condition. But for that reason, Hashem commands us. But for what purpose? Aside from this is the fact that the ultimate purpose of each mitzvah is to fulfill Hashem's desire, and that's found equally in every mitzvah. But on a deeper level, the word mitzvah is connected to the word tzavta, bond, connection. That in each mitzvah, Hashem gives us the opportunity to bond to Him on a whole different level, to bond the physical and the spiritual, the infinite and the finite, and so on and so forth. So in the onset, the mitzvah goes against the grain. But the preparation for the mitzvah and the performance of the mitzvah and the sustenance of this mitzvah are all part of the bonding experience. We know this to be true in relationships. Lahavdil, to differentiate from the Gottman Institute. I posted a reel last week where where there was a question about harmony versus disharmony, and the reality is every couple is given harmonious and disharmonious times. We always want to focus on the harmonious time, but what happens when it comes to the disharmony time? So the thought is that this harmonious time is not an impediment to the harmony, just the opposite. It gives you an opportunity to harmonize a whole different level, to include that which was initially either completely on the outskirts or completely outside of the frame of the relationship, or would have driven the relationship outside of its own framework, but then to utilize this in order to grow. And when the couple does this correctly, then not only that part remains outside, but it becomes the ultimate perpetuation of the relationship. So not to look at the disharmonious time as something that impedes, but just the opposite, as an invitation for growth. So the same would apply when it comes to the mitzvah of envy. If envy is simply part of the human condition, the way they were created, then yeah, maybe it will be, maybe there is a thought that it's impossible to rid ourselves of this. But the truth of the matter, if Hashem commands us, yeah, it might initially go against the grain. But ultimately, it is there to help us achieve what we're here to achieve. So in this week's Parsha, we're given the Ten Commandments. It's very interesting because we're given the Torah discusses the Ten Commandments in two separate parshiot. We have in this week's Parsha, Yitro, and later on in the book of Devarim, Parshat V'Chanan, the Ten Commandments are reiterated again, but with a slightly different verbiage. So let's compare and contrast how the Torah formalizes the words in both the Ten Commandments. In this week's Parsha and Parsha V'Chanan. This week's Parsha says, Lo tachmod beit re'echa, lo tachmod eshet re'echa, v'avdo, v'amato, v'shoro, v'chabro, v'kol shel re'echa. You should not be jealous from your fellow's home. You should not be jealous of your fellow's spouse, or his servant, or his maidservant, or his ox, or his donkey, and everything that belongs to that belongs to your friend. You should not be jealous of. However, in Parshat V'Chanan, there's a slight difference, but it's a foundational difference. It says, Lo tachmod, yeah, you should not be jealous of your neighbor's wife. In other words, how come his spouse, and how come their marriage, and how come this, and mine's not? But then, Lo titaveh beit recha, you should not be envious of your fellow's home, or his field, or his servant, or his maidservant, or his ox, and his donkey, and everything that belongs to your fellow. So in this week's parsha, it's brought as don't be jealous. In Parsha V'Chanan, it says don't be envious. What's the difference? What's the difference between jealousy and envy? Lo tachmod, you should not be jealous. Jealousy, as explained by our sages, is a feeling that's born from the inside, in inadequacy, etc., but a one that doesn't just remain emotional or mental or psychological, but rather one that drives behaviors, that actually results in actual behavior. In other words, when a person sees that so-and-so has a nice car, or a nice this or that, in jealousy, they start trying to force the person, I want what you have. Give me what you have. Let me buy it. I'll buy with the most, I'll give you 10 times as much as money as you bought it for. In other words, to exact pressures in order to be able to elicit this from them. Some commentators explain that the mitzvah is only violated if the person the person that the pressure was forced upon will eventually give the item to the person without any money. If they put guilt or this and this and that, oh, I didn't have this, I don't have this, and could you please? So, okay, I'll give you. But the Rambam rules that even if the person pays the money for it, even if he gives in 10 times as much, nevertheless, this is violating the mitzvah. In other words, jealousy in itself is not just a feeling, it's not just a psychological disposition, it's one that forces the person starts forcing this upon the other people around them. Again, it's born out of a feeling of inadequacy. I don't have, how come him and not me? Versus envy. What does that mean? Envy is much more sublime than jealousy. And to a certain measure, it can be even more destructive than jealousy. Both are toxic. But we're going to see that envy could be more destructive. Because envy remains in the state of the psychological self. It remains inbound. The person doesn't act on it. He doesn't speak about it. He just feels it. He holds it inside. It's brought down, and it's brought down the Rambam rules that anyone who envies the home or the spouse of his friend, just the fact that he is envious in his mind or in his heart, how should he get this? He starts thinking, how could I get this? He doesn't express it. He's not going to let it come into action. He's just thinking about it. The Rambam says he violated the negative precept of don't be envious. Now, to put it in perspective, it's important to say that it doesn't mean that if I see something that someone has and I say, how do I get one of these? How do I accomplish this? How do I achieve this? How do I buy one of these? Not that particular item that he has, but something like that. That's not necessarily violating the mitzvah. There is a concept of kina seferim, of holy envy. Like Rachel had to Leah, when she saw that Leah was giving birth to the children, she was envious of her because she said, I too want to achieve this. I too want to contribute to the Jewish people. There's a concept of holy envy, which means an envy, not that it's not fair that she has a son and I don't. Why her, not me? There's an envy that perpetuates, I want to become holy. I want to become better. As brought down in Hayom Yom from the Rebbe, when it comes to material welfare, a person should look beneath them. In other words, look how blessed I am. Look how much I have. I have so much, Baruch Hashem, and so doesn't have this. Not, God forbid, to look down on them, but just to understand how blessed we are. But in matters of holiness, the person should always look upwards. Look at how much they so-and-so accomplished. How do I accomplish this too? How do I work on myself in order to get there? Not that it's not fair that this person has and I didn't. This person had opportunities I don't. The opposite is to look inwards. How do I accomplish this? And therefore, yeah, you could come to the person and says, what was your secret? What was your method? What did you implement? What did you utilize in order to get there? I too want to grow. But nevertheless, that's the difference between jealousy and envy. Again, jealousy is not just a thought, it's not just an emotion, but it'll drive the person to actualize it. Envy could very well just remain in a thought, in the emotions, but nevertheless is no less destructive than jealousy. Give me 1 second. I need to bring a charger. Because they truly do have everything. So going back to the Sefer HaChinuch, after posing this question, how is it possible for a human being to be able to rid themselves and to actually of envy and jealousy when this is basic to the human condition? He does a complete turnaround and pushes that question. Says obviously, it's within the capacity of the human being to prevent themselves from thinking and implementing their desire from when it's toxic. It is obviously within the ability of each and every one of us to be able to command our disposition. Because ultimately, one's heart is in their own hands. In other words, we're created with the ability to govern our thoughts and our emotions. As the Alter Rebbe himself explains in the Tanya, in chapter 12 of the Tanya, which is the conclusion of the first 12 chapters, are the foundation of Tanya. And in chapter 12 of Tanya, the Alter Rebbe teaches a foundational principle to serving Hashem, a foundational truth, which is moach shalit halalev betoldato v'tev yitzirto, that the mind governs the heart in the way that we're created. In other words, we're created with the capacity that our minds should govern our hearts. And Alter Rebbe continues, Shekol Adam Yachol B'Ritzono, that each person could accomplish through their mind, their will and their mind, to hold back the incongruency and to command their whims and not to give them expression and not to act on them, not in thought, not in speech, and not in action. In other words, we're created with the ability to govern our thought, speech, and action. Alter Rebbe makes it very clear, we are not responsible for the initial thought that comes in or the initial emotions. That comes from Hashem. That is signals from Hashem to the highest of the level of the soul, and that streams down. But when Hashem gives us this, it doesn't mean that we have to entertain it, that we have to host it. Those kind of incongruent thoughts, speech, and action, we have to drive away immediately. And that was in our capacity to achieve. To divert our minds completely from the toxic thought or from the toxic emotion, and to give precedence to holiness. The very famous mashal, and that's a story that happened with one of the students of the Mezritcher Magid that came to him and asked him, how do I rid myself of these incongruent thoughts? They come to me, they plague me. I know that the Alter Rebbe says that it's possible, but I don't see it achievable. So the Rebbe instructs him to get into his wagon and travel to the other side of the city, where he's going and to come to one of the senior Hasidim and ask him of how to do this correctly. He'll teach you. And so excitedly, this Chassid got into his carriage and drove all the way to the other side of the city. It took him hours. And eventually, towards evening, he arrives and he comes to the door of the senior Chassid and he knocks on the door. And nobody's answering. He clearly sees that the candle is burning. If the candle is burning, it's not like somebody left a light on. That we very particular with the candles, as candles were very expensive. If nobody is home or everybody wants to sleep, the candle will be off. So he notes that the candle is burning, so he must be up. So he knocks louder. And still no answer. He goes around to the window, and he indeed sees that the senior chassid is sitting there by the candlelight, learning. So he starts knocking on the window. But again, there's no answer. Not only there's no answer, he notices that the chassid doesn't even look upwards to see who's knocking. So he knocks even louder. Hey, open up. Nothing. At this time, he's very frustrated. Took all this way for nothing. And even more so, he can't even leave because it's too late and it's dangerous to drive back to his city. So what he did was go back into his carriage, decide he's going to sleep. He's going to sleep until the morning, and then he's going to leave. An hour or two later, the senior chassid comes out of his house, comes to the carriage, and wakes this young chassid up and asks him, how could I help you? And with frustration says, what do you mean, how could you help me? Well, I don't understand. A few hours ago, I came to your door, I knocked, and you didn't answer. I knocked loud, you didn't answer. Then I come to the window, I see you're there, and I knocked. You didn't even bother looking up. What kind of business is this? He says to him, again, how could I help you? He said, well, the Rebbe sent me to learn from you how to control my thoughts. He says, if that's the case, I already taught you. So what do you mean you taught me how to? I knocked and you didn't even open the door. You didn't even look up. What do you mean you taught me? He says, no. Consider this. You came to my house, knocked on my door. It's my house, my door. I decide who I get up and who I open up the door for. Lock louder didn't change anything. Still my house, still my door, still my choice. And that wasn't good enough. You went around and knocked on my window. But once again, my window, my house, my window, I decide who I look up and who I don't. That's how you control your thoughts. But the thoughts could come and knock. The emotions could come knock. But who said you need to open up the door to them? Who said that you need to entertain them? If they come knocking, there's a reason why they're coming knocking. Hashem sent them by divine providence. But in this moment, the opportunity is by deferring them. That's the growth. Not by entertaining. Just because it came into your mind doesn't mean you have to allow it to remain there. These kind of unwanted guests, it's like those guests who come to a party and they get drunk and they become all riled up and starts fighting and this, and they do this consistently. And each time they come into the party, they do this, and so the host knows the disposition. And once the guest comes and is more timid and says, "Listen, I change, let me in." Says, "No, each time you come in, you create havoc. He said, no, this time I won't. So he lets him in. But sure enough, once he lets him in, after a few drinks, he goes berserk again. So too, there are certain thoughts and emotions that we know that repeated unwanted guests, and we know what they do to us or what they can do. Because the Torah tells us. When they come, we have to divert our minds from it. Each one of us has the ability to govern our thoughts. Very simple. As we looked at the warrior to warrior class and the experiment that we did when we were asked to close our eyes and imagine a very negative occurrence that happened, somebody really hurt us, and then we asked, how do you feel? Could you connect to that emotion in that moment? And then we diverted and said, okay, let's move away from that for a second. Now think about a very pleasant experience, like a birthday party, a surprise party, a gift, and think about what you felt and who did it. And then after we open up our eyes, I asked everyone, all right, so were you able to connect to that negative situation? Yes. Did you feel that emotions? For the most part, a lot of people said yes, even now. And then the question was, okay, so what happened when you started focusing on the positive experience and the positive emotions? Did you connect to that? Yes. So what happened to the negative thoughts and the negative emotions that were born out of those negative thoughts while you were focusing on the positive? So that moment, we didn't feel it. We didn't think about it. It says this is mochli love. And each and every one of us has the ability to focus, divert our thoughts from something toxic and focusing on something positive. We're able to reframe the thought from perception to perspective. I remember once asking a shaliach when we were forbringing, he was speaking about this. I asked him this question. So how do we do this? How do we think differently? Because, there's a saying, if you can't change your dilemma, change the way you think. If you can't change your problems, think about the way you think about your problem, and your dilemma will look differently. Think differently. So I asked him, what does it mean to think differently here? And he asked me point blank, says, tell me, what is the color of a triangle? First, I thought I didn't understand. I didn't hear him correctly. I said, what? I said, what is the color of a triangle? I said, which triangle? He says, any triangle. I said, well, a triangle is not a color. A triangle is a generic shape. It's without color. It says, and nevertheless, I'm asking you, what color is a triangle? I said, I don't understand the question. Since in your mind, the triangle is a generic shape without color. If you had to give a triangle a color, what color would you give it? I says, oh, if that's the case, yellow. It says, see, now that's already reframing the original. You're looking at it differently. We have that ability to govern and maneuver our thoughts, our words, and our actions. We're not helpless victims to them. These are all opportunities. If a person has envy or toxic desire, first and foremost, on the most basic level, divert your mind from it. Go focus on anything else. Anything else. Because as we learned a week ago, sometimes in giving this negative thought, try to fight it in itself, not only is that prudent, it's going to drag the person low into the muck. And that for that reason, the Rebbe often would suggest to people who continuously fight certain dispositions of theirs, certain habits, certain mindsets, et cetera, but to no avail, the Rebbe says, Yasiach daitem is divert your mind from it. Because there are many times that the negativity is just a lapse of positive. If the positive was positive enough, there would be no reason for negative. And for that reason, instead of fighting with the negativity, focus on the positive. Okay, so you don't have the ability to deal with this right now? Okay, so you don't. But who said right now you have to deal with it? Right now, focus on that which does work. Your strength and amplify that, amplify, and then you'll produce enough light to be able to rid yourself of this darkness. Because light doesn't have to fight darkness in order for it to prevail. Light just has to be itself, and darkness immediately has no place to exist. The very famous Mashpia passed away. Actually, I had the privilege of bringing with him. Passed away in the early 2002, I believe 2002, 2003, something like that. His name was Reuven Dunin. He was a Baal Tshuva from the 60s, who was a farmer in Israel as well, but he became a tremendous mishpia for thousands. When he first came to the Rebbe, and his first yechidus, for his first private voice with the Rebbe, which was in the initial steps of his tshuva, he opened to the Rebbe all of his sins, all of the negativities, everything he messed up with. And he cried to the Rebbe, Rebbe, help me, I need a tikkun. The Rebbe says, okay, I hear, let me consider this. And in subsequent yechidus, in a subsequent audience, we'll discuss this. In a subsequent meeting, we'll discuss this. But 20 years elapsed, and the Rebbe didn't bring this once. And a chassid knows, if the Rebbe didn't bring it, doesn't bring it, you don't bring it up. But the Rebbe didn't bring it up even once. Meanwhile, the Rebbe gave him instruction of how to grow and how to learn and where to learn. And eventually, he rose to the prominence of 20 years down. Later, in one of the private yechidus, the Rebbe opens up and says, you asked me a question of a tikkun, now let's talk about it. Why? Because sometimes in order to deal with the negative, first you have to build up the positive. You have to build and build and build. Don't focus on the negative. Maybe we don't have the strength right now to deal with it. Maybe the fact that we have that desire, the inclination to fix it, that's a yetzer hara, because the yetzer hara knows that the more we'll struggle with it, the harder it becomes. And they'll deplete us. Mendel says that when he was in the gulags, he saw a spider web in one of the corners, and he laid there and focusing on. Mendel had a tremendous ability to implement with the Baal Shem Tov's instruction that from everything that we see in here, there's a divine lesson, and everything that he experienced was always a source of farbrengens. So he watched it in one of the farbrengens. Later on, he explained that he noticed a phenomenon that when the fly or whatever creature gets caught up in the net of the web, the spider doesn't immediately pounce. It waits. Initially, he was thinking, why does he wait? Why he has it already? To give it time is he might lose his food. He might lose his prey. He has it now. Go after it now. He says no. Why? Because by initially getting caught, the fly or whatever it is still has a lot of strength and even more fight or flight inside of it. And if it would see the spider come out immediately, it would tap into his flight or flight reserve and push even stronger than he had conventionally pushed to get out. So he won't. So the spider doesn't pounce immediately because he knows this. What does he do? Rather than pounce immediately, he waits. What does he wait for? He waits for this fly to try to get out of the web, but the more it tries to get out on the conventional level, the more it gets caught up in the web. And the more it gets caught up, the harder it is to try to get out. The harder it is to get out, the more energy it needs to expend to try to get out. But the more it does that, the more it depletes itself, to the extent that after a certain while, it's so depleted that it just accepts its fate. And that's when the spider comes and attacks. Says the Remendel, this is a tremendous lesson in serving God. The Yetzer Hara knows the more we fight with it, the more we deplete ourselves from our natural born joy and happiness. The less joy and happiness we have, the less harder it is to struggle, the more we start accepting the dire straits as a reality. And that's inevitably what happened to the 80% in Egypt that decided to stay in Egypt. They felt so broken. They was like, what's the point of moving forward? There's no point. They accepted it. Sometimes getting out of Egypt means learning how to divert our mind from this Egypt, knowing that this is not our setting. And if it's not our setting, so what is our setting? Well, let's focus on what does work. Where are our strengths? Now, again, this is not at all the times, because there are times when we have to deal with things. It's just regarding certain inyanim, certain matters which we feel that we can't currently, or we don't have the sufficient knowledge or the sufficient resources. And this is good to discuss with your mentor or whoever it is, your rabbi, your rebbetzin, your mentor, to know when is where. But sometimes the prudent path is, at least for the time being, is not to fight it, or rather divert your mind from it. We'll continue this in Mercy Hashem tomorrow.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Don't forget to eat the